Hello, everyone. I am ZHAO Chuang. Today, let's get to know Biber the Stegosaurus. Stegosaurus, one of the most famous dinosaurs, is beloved by everyone. It had a unique appearance. The most striking part is the rows of bony plates on its back, which is its diagnostic feature. And about the role and function of this feature, scientists have been arguing endlessly. This model, Biber the Stegosaurus, mainly refers to a specimen called Roadkill. Because that specimen was preserved well and presented a tragic scene, it was nicknamed Roadkill. Scientists often give nicknames to many characteristic specimens, for example, an Allosaurus specimen called Big Al, or another relatively complete juvenile Stegosaurus specimen was given a girl's name Sophie. The Stegosaurus specimen Sophie is also an essential reference in the reconstruction process of this model. First, let's take a look at its body. Since Stegosaurus was first discovered, people have noticed its several characteristics. Its head was small, its hind limbs were long, its forelimbs were short, and its trunk was stout. The figure of Stegosaurus often led people to think that it was a narrow animal, but it was not. If you've seen a complete Stegosaurus specimen, you'll see that the animal was very broad. Looking from the top, you can see that it is narrow at the shoulders, but its pelvis is very wide. We can also know this from other stegosaurians. One species of Wuosaurus is W. homini. Its pelvis was very flat, which can indirectly indicate that the pelvis of this animal was relatively broad and thick. When researchers first discovered Stegosaurus, they mistakenly thought it was an animal that walked on its hind limbs, so the early restored Stegosaurus all walked on two legs like Godzilla, with its tail dragging on the ground. This was the recognition of the Stegosaurus when people first discovered it. Then, let's move to its bony plates and the tail spikes. At the first discovery of Stegosaurus, its bony plates and tail spikes were unearthed. However, researchers at that time did not know how they were arranged on the body, because these bony plates and spikes were scattered and not connected to the body skeleton. After the animal died and the skin and flesh rotted away, the bony plates were scattered all over the ground. Therefore, when researchers in the early years initially restored Stegosaurus, they made it look like a pangolin, believing that these bony plates were like fish scales, covering it from head to tail. At that time, researchers might think that the remains were incomplete, and when alive, its body might have more bony plates, shaping it into an appearance wrapped in plates. The spikes on the tail were thought to have grown in the gaps between these plates. So the earliest restorations of Stegosaurus looked like a giant pangolin. Later, many relatively complete Stegosaurus fossils were collected. Some showed that the bony plates were usually on the back, with one or two always located in the same position. And their location, the depression, was always facing the backbone, so people realized these bony plates might have grown along the back, just like the structure of modern iguanas. But the fossil materials found then were not preserved intact either, so people didn't know how these plates were arranged on the back. So in some restorations at that stage, as people were uncertain about the exact number of them, they just made a row of bony plates on its back like an iguana. This was also an earlier restoration. At that time, scholars also believed that there might be 8 tail spikes because a relatively long and flexible section was found at the end of its tail, and 8 spikes could be placed one by one within this section, so they made 8 spikes on the tail. When the spikes were first found, they were next to the tailbone, and scholars have realized that the spikes were situated on the tail but didn't know how many spikes there were. So early restorations put 8 spikes on the tail. You can see this image in the movie King Kong in 1933, and a close-up showed 8 spikes on the tail. You can also see the image with a row of bony plates on the back in some old movies or very early books about Stegosaurus. In the 1940s and 1950s, or the 1950s and 1960s, people found some specimens with more than 20 bony plates next to a skeleton. Obviously, these plates couldn't fit in one row, so they were arranged into rows. However, the 2 rows of bony plates were arranged symmetrically. During the same period, people did find many other stegosaurians, such as Tuojiangosaurus or Harangosaurus from Sichuan,
which showed that they had symmetrical bone plates on their backs.
Therefore, people also made the bony plates of Stegosaurus symmetrical at the time, but after careful research, it was found that the bony plates of Stegosaurus were not the same as those of the mentioned dinosaurs. Because the dorsal bony plates of Stegosaurus were irregular in shape and size, no two bony plates were mirrored. If they appeared in pairs,
they must have two identical bony plates.
Therefore, people later discovered that the bony plates of Stegosaurus were asymmetrical. And through a series of more complete materials, the specific arrangement of the bony plates is finally known.
One of the significant discoveries is made based on the reference blueprint of this model,
the Roadkill. That specimen clearly shows the appearance of the Stegosaurus before its death. Its back was alternately arranged with two rows of bony plates, which merged into one row near the tail. Among the well-preserved Stegosaurus specimens known so far, the specimen, Roadkill, presents the largest bony plates, and because the bony plates are big, there are not too many pieces, or they could not be placed in.
So this Stegosaurus specimen has fewer bony plates of only 17 pieces.
There are 3 pairs of bony plates on its neck, which are all palm-shaped. Then, the bony plates gradually become larger at the shoulders, and the largest one appears at the top of the pelvis, with a height of nearly 1 meter. If you add the keratin, which this plate was covered by when alive, it might reach a height of 1 meter or more. This bony plate is also broad. You can see that the width of this bony plate, above the tail, is greater than the height. It is diamond-shaped. The tip of the diamond points to the rear of the body.
The plates gradually contract when coming toward the end of the tail.
In the flexible section of its tail, 3 bony plates are arranged in a single row. The tail of Stegosaurus was very flexible. Not just Stegosaurus, this group of animals all possessed a very flexible tail, which is the opposite of many other herbivorous dinosaurs. The larger many dinosaurs were, the less flexible their tail was. Because once the animal got too big, the tail was heavy, and if the tail was flexible, it would tend to drop down.
We now know that the Stegosaurus tail was not dragged on the ground but raised in the air.
It had many heavy bony plates on the dorsal side, and heavy spikes at the end. It needed the tail spikes to form an enormous scope of the attack, so it should keep the tail very flexible. Its tail structure was exceptional. Powerful muscles pulled its tail, making it flexible and soft. There were no ossified tendons on the tail, and to keep it flexible,
the bony plates above the tail had also merged into a single row, so that they would not affect the range of its movement.
In addition, the forelimbs of Stegosaurus were much smaller than its hindlimbs, which indicates that this animal was not suitable for fast running, so we believe that Stegosaurus was a slow-moving animal. For a quadruped, its forelimbs must be at least as long as its hindlimbs to run fast. Among dinosaurs, it was common that the forelimbs were short, and the hindlimbs were long. Hadrosaurs also had short front legs, and long hind legs. The footprint fossils show that hadrosaurs raised their forelimbs when running and used their 2 hindlimbs to run. Stegosaurus obviously would not run like that because its body was too bulky, and its front half was heavy. Some bipedal footprints of Stegosaurians have indeed been found, but from the pace, we can infer that this dinosaur walked slowly,
which means that its front legs did lift up,
but only for a short distance. Stegosaurus walked on all 4s most of the time, but because it was a dinosaur with a relatively strong defensive capability, it might not need to run but fight back like Ankylosaurus. It might stroll at regular times.
Its front legs were not the same length as its hind legs.
If it ran too fast, it could not coordinate them well. For example, if the pace of the hindlimbs exceeded the distance of the forelimbs, it would easily fall over. People used to believe that Stegosaurus had a short neck. Looking at the early restorations, you will find that the neck of Stegosaurus was often shaped to be relatively short. Still, the specimen Sophie, a juvenile Stegosaurus, shows that Stegosaurus actually had a very long neck. The previously collected Stegosaurus fossils, because the bones were dislocated during burial, for example, the scapula slipping a little forward and blocking part of the cervical vertebrae, made it difficult to distinguish between the cervical and thoracic spine. But the specimen Sophie preserved a partial neck perfectly, showing that Stegosaurus was actually a long-necked animal. When we shaped this dinosaur model, we adjusted its neck to a more accurate shape, according to the proportion of Sophie, so its neck looks longer and more flexible. The neck of Stegosaurus was indeed relatively flexible. By scanning its skull and reconstructing it with a computer, it is found that the joints are very flexible. Its neck can swing up into an S shape, so you can see that the bony plates on its neck were relatively small so that its flexible neck would not be affected by the bony plates at the dorsal side when it moved. The head of Stegosaurus was slender, narrow, and long. It had a small mouth with a beak at the front, which is also a characteristic of this group of animals.
Its teeth were small and had an unusual shape,
which looked like a coin with serrations around it, similar to a leaf or petal. Of course, this model is very small, it is difficult to show the detailed appearance of its teeth.
In addition, let's talk about its limbs.
Stegosaurus had limbs that were good at walking. It had 5 fingers on each forelimb. The middle 3 were relatively developed, and the other 2 have degenerated, forming to small bulges. Its 3 toes were used for walking,
and when walking,
it mainly relied on the inner 3 ones to bear the weight. Besides, only the inner 2 of these 3 fingers had claws, so although Stegosaurus had 5 fingers, only 2 had nails. The hind limbs of Stegosaurus possessed typical ornithopod feet,
which have degenerated with only 3 toes
and looked like those of hadrosaurs. Its 3 toes were similar to sauropods, which merged into a fleshy ball. The inner claw was the largest, and the outer 2 gradually became smaller. Then, we move on to talk about the skin of Stegosaurus. At present, we have found many complete Stegosaurus fossils with preserved skin. The collected skin fossils of Stegosaurus mainly come from the side of the body, and we can infer what the whole side looked like.
It had delicate scales with coin-sized bumps scattered between them,
just as this area shows. Some intact specimens show this part of the leg. When we made the model, the position and number of scales in this part were deduced by referring to those complete specimens. Then, about the tail spikes of Stegosaurus. If you look at the early restorations of Stegosaurus, you will see that its tail spikes were facing upwards. But now, after careful research, we know that its tail spikes almost extended horizontally.
This is because there is a plane at the root of the tail.
By comparing this plane and the angle of the tail vertebrae, you will find that the most suitable distance is the horizontal distance. The placement of the spikes in several complete specimens also verified this statement, which displays the tail spikes of Stegosaurus were arranged horizontally. People used to mistakenly think that the tail spikes were the continuation of the spikes on the back and then evolved like this, but now we find that this is not the case.
They were actually a continuation from these side bumps, and became developed on the tail.
This also proves that this animal's tail was good at swinging from side to side, and the horizontal spikes were more conducive to strike.
At last, I would like to talk about the surface texture of the Stegosaurus bony plates,
which has been controversial for a long time. There were several theories in the early days,
one of which believed that there was skin wrapping them because people did find many blood grooves on the surface.
So at the time, people thought that the bony plates were covered by skin with blood vessels buried underside, which assisted Stegosaurus in dissipating heat. When the blood flew through, and the wind blew at the seam of the bony plates, it would make it feel cooler. When its body was too cold, it could expose the bony plates to the sun for a while to warm the blood. It might have such a function. This is the most popular and common theory. Of course, this statement cannot be denied as there were indeed many blood vessels on the bony plates. And now, through CT technology, it is found that not just on the surface, it also had larger blood channels inside. This shows the blood did flow through the bony plates, so this statement cannot be ruled out. Another statement is a bit far-fetched,
or can't say it is far-fetched,
but it has some characteristics of times. Some scholars believed that, when blood flew through the bony plates would turn red, and the color change could function as intimidation. For example, this theory was shown in Walking with Dinosaurs, filmed by the British BBC in 1999, which was a very influential statement at the time. But now we don't think so because people later found a complete bony plate fossil of Hesperosaurus, a close relative of Stegosaurus. It is an impression fossil of a bony plate, which retains the appearance of its surface when it was alive, proving that its surface is a layer of smooth keratinous structures. There are fine lines on these keratinous structures, running from the root to the top, with a texture like the effect of fiber drawing. The edges of this Hesperosaurus bony plate are very sharp, proving it had a defensive capability. At first, people believed that the bony plates of Stegosaurus could be defensive. However, considering that the bony plates were not connected to the body skeleton,
this statement was once abandoned,
and it was believed that they could not provide protection. But this sharp-edged fossil shows that the plate had a certain protective ability. In addition, the surface had a layer of keratin. The keratinous structure means that it would not change color because we know that human nails will not change color, and the turtle shell will not change color either. The keratinous structure indicates that it might have eye-catching patterns, like those of the tortoise shell. Good, the above concludes our introduction to Biber the Stegosaurus. Thank you all.